Why would a good God who loves my sister allow this to happen to someone who did nothing to precipitate it? What does God do with suffering? What is the place of suffering in a larger story? What chapter does it fill? And after she was able to kind of re-navigate that, she found herself thriving on the backside of it.
For those of you that maybe aren't familiar with your story, you've been here a couple of times. We talked about it. It's always fascinating. You once described yourself as an angry atheist. You saw the worst in mankind. How did that factor into your journey of embracing Christ and believing?
Well, I think one of the things that delayed it was that so many of the people we would take to jail would tell us that they were believers. And I thought, okay.
Something's not connecting.
Something's not connecting here. And then the few Christians I did know on the job, and there's only a couple that I could really identify that were Christians in my agency. And those guys, if you asked them, like, why is this true? Although they were so evidential about everything else that they would talk about. You know, if we're making a case on somebody, I can give you the 15 reasons why we can win this in trial.
Yeah, because you got to build that evidence for the court.
But they couldn't do this for Christianity. So it's felt to me, and I know this isn't true, but it felt at the time like there were two kind of groups within the church. Those who really could not defend what they believed. So in my sense, as that was being my thinking, it was because it wasn't true. And the other group were the people who thought it was true but didn't behave as though it was true.
Huh.
So what made me angry about it was I kind of saw that hypocrisy that probably a lot of non-believers see in Christians in general, because let's face it, this is one of the chapters in this book, we all are a mess.
Yeah, all sinners saved by grace.
Yes, this enigma of man, this idea that we are a mess, is an important issue to cover with our kids, because they're going to see this in others.
Mm-hmm. Today we do want to drill into kind of the behavior of the dark side, if you want to call it that, the criminal mindset, and we'll get into that. But your knowledge of Scripture, combining that with your detective work, you've observed some fascinating things about human nature and what allows us to thrive in the context of healthiness. Just what's the overall premise of the book then when it comes to criminal behavior?
Well, and I've written books, that make a case for why Christianity is true. And I think as a boomer in my age, that was important to me. I was 35 when I first started investigating the case for Christianity. Susie and I were together already 18 years.
Wow. Yeah.
So there was not, it's like we were already pretty far along on this journey, and I needed to know, is this true evidentially? So I spent the time to make the case. But I think that my grandkids probably won't be as focused on that side of it. Is it true? What they really want to know is it good?
Huh.
Because they're surrounded by a culture which is really kind of more of a negative perspective on Christianity now than ever before. And the argument is that every ism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, whatever the thing is that the culture has said, you ought not be that. They're pointing to us and saying, well, you're the reason why people are that way. Christianity is where all that stuff comes from.
Right.
I think that my grandkids are going to want to know two things. Is it true? But also, is it good? Does it help us to flourish? So this book kind of takes a sideways look at that. What this does is it gives us, I think, 15 rules for life. And these are 15 rules that the secular research demonstrates. So if you didn't know anything about Christianity and you just wanted to thrive, you could find these in the secular research on human flourishing. But it turns out these are ancient principles. They're all in Scripture. And so this kind of provides evidence. If Christianity is true, it ought to explain us the way we really are. And it turns out that it does. So it's just another piece of a larger cumulative case that demonstrates that Christianity is not only, true, it's good.
Yeah.
Because it turns out that if you would simply, if you don't believe that Christianity is true, if you lived as though it was,
you'd have a good
flourish.
life. Yeah, you'd have a flourishing life. That's so right. True. In that respect, you have examples of criminal behavior. I think greed is one of them, obviously. I mean, greed, you want what somebody else has, so you go kill them and take it, or take it and run away and try to live that way. How did greed overtake the life of, I think it's Jackson Kelcher? What was Kelcher's thing, and how did greed become illustrated through his example?
Well, look, there's only 3 reasons for any misbehavior, and I think we talked about this once when I was here before, and that's just sex, money, and power. That's it. There's not a fourth motive for murder. There's not a fourth motive for any crime. Those are the things that drive us to misbehave. And once you know that, well, you can kind of rein that in your own. You can say, look, if I'm going to go sideways on any particular day, it's going to be in one of those 3 areas. So I now know what to guard. But I met this kid when I was working much earlier in my career, And he was, a gangster at the time. And I remember telling him, hey, you want the same thing in life. You want the security of a place to live. You want to build a car you can trust. You want to have a love interest that you can live with. All the same things every human wants. The only difference is how we get those things. And I remember having a long conversation about because he'd basically steal these things and then spend 5 years in jail. And I thought, he would argue.
And you're the detective booking this guy.
And I'm just a guy
time.
working gangs who was booking him the first time. And I remember thinking, hey, there's a better way for you. He was like, well, no, why would I want to go to school and do all of that? He thought we are both going to spend some time doing something we don't want to do in order to get this. I'm just doing mine in jail. You're doing yours in college.
Huh.
That was his view.
That's an interesting approach.
Yeah. So I thought, okay, well, so I had this long conversation with him. Years later, he's doing a robbery series. Now I'm a detective, and now I'm arresting him in this capacity. And I remember trying to remind him of this conversation we had earlier.
How many years before?
It had been probably 8 years or something before, and it basically had no impact. Nothing I said had any impact on him. But I realized in that interim that what he is looking for is something that he could have achieved, right? So, for example, if financial independence is not the ability to buy anything, but to buy anything you want, and I no longer want all those things, then I can be financially independent today. Another way of putting it is this way. If there's something you think would make life meaningful, something you want to have, something you want to buy, well, you could spend your whole life just trying to get it. Or you could decide today that what you have makes you happy. One of these two ways makes you happy today. The other might be a pursuit that never ends for you. And so this young man continued to kind of struggle with what do I want? It turns out that he was doing this because he had a friend who was also involved in a very similar robbery series, and he was just looking over there and seeing what that guy was getting.
The other guy.
In
kind of a dark context.
And so much of how we identify ourselves is not really based on us alone. It's us compared to somebody else. It's not about whether I'm rich. It's about whether I'm richer than you. It's not about whether I'm smart. It's about whether I'm smarter than you. And he was doing this. He was coveting something he didn't have and trying to figure out a way to get it. And it turns out there's such great value in work because I think that there's an embedded difficulty.
Sure.
Work is hard.
Yeah.
And it turns out it produces character because it is hard.
How, Jim, do we help as a Christian parent? How do I help my kids grab onto that in a world that is increasingly it's a cacophony of messages about discontentment?
In that kind of a world, I think we need to take a second with our kids to show them the crash that occurs on the other side. Where does that worldview lead? And that's what I was trying to do with him. Because it turned out, I told him, I said, look, I get it. You want these things. I've wanted them too. And you are trying to achieve these things, albeit through crimes. I also try to achieve these things through work. The difference is I know where I'm going to be sleeping tonight. And you're about to go from here to county custody, and who knows where from there. In other words, I have some control over what my tonight will be like that you are about to relinquish altogether. So these two worldviews have two completely different destinations. Do our kids even know? And I think part of it is you've seen these Scared Straight kind of TV shows, and that's really what they're trying to do there. Is they're trying to say, hey, you think you know where this is headed. You think you know something about being a punk, a gangster, or whatever it is. And it's usually a guy who's been through the entire system, been in and out of jail his entire life. And he's simply trying to tell the kid, let me tell you where this really leads. Let me open your eyes to what it's really like in there, where this is really going to be like. And I think for us, this is why, it's about comparing worldviews now.
Wow.
And demonstrating, does that worldview give you what you think you want?
You speak about the issue of suffering, and you have a story in there about Kelly Winston, whose sister, I think, was murdered.
Right.
And what did you observe about Kelly and the family that gave you an insight on the issue of suffering?
Well, sad but true, most of the victims I've worked, if you look back at the course of their life, you can see all of the dominoes that fell that got them into the situation that night that led to their death. And so part of what we're doing to solve the case is to retrace all of those dominoes. And sometimes it's because you're dating the wrong person. You moved in next door to something. You're hanging out with the wrong people. There's something. But this particular murder was a murder in which this young girl did nothing to even put herself in a position. She just happened to be working that night when a guy came back to her business and ended up killing her. She did nothing there's nothing she could have done differently, let's put it that way. So the family, when they experienced this, they were so utterly shocked. They were shook so deeply that they were kind of frozen in time. No one in that family moved. The parents, of course, she was in her 20s when she was killed. Their parents were older. The stress killed one of them. The other wallowed and didn't celebrate holidays, didn't really do much of anything. The sister was the younger sister at the time, just adored her older sister, was so deeply shaken by it that she wasn't dating. She was just frozen. And so when I reopened the case, I remember being very careful about making that first meeting because I don't want to give anyone false hope. Just because the case is being reopened doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere.
Later.
It's years later. It's probably now. It was probably 20 years later.
Wow.
And I could see that she had hope. But I wanted to kind of temper it because I didn't want her to think, hey, just because we're reopening it, we're going to solve it. We may not. There were lots of cases where we reopened and we never got to solve. Mm-hmm. They just weren't solvable cases. So I wasn't sure where we were headed with this. But I remember her description of how she felt like the family could just not move on. And she was a believer. So the question becomes, the idea of suffering and how we engage trauma became really important to me.
Well, in fact, you said there were 3 outcomes that you wrote about in the book. What were those 3 outcomes?
Well, okay, so let me back up for a second. So trauma, if you think about it, is that we have a view of the world that is entirely shattered. Our expectations, what we think is going to happen in life, are absolutely shattered. We think, I'm going to be a happily married person with kids, and then you're divorced, or you lose a kid to an illness. These kinds of things shatter us because they defeat our expectations. This is what happened for them. They had an expectation life would be a certain way, and then this terrible crime occurs that entirely shatters their expectations. And people have studied this. And we see this in also the lives of officers who have been critically injured in critical incidents, that they don't think this is ever going to happen to them, and then it does, and now what do I do? And if you stay in that depressed response where you can't get back on your feet, if you stay down there, we call that PTSD. If you just get back to where you were functioning before the incident occurred, we call that resiliency. So here's the key according to secularists, okay? It's something that they call meaning making. Now, it makes sense. Here's why. You have an expectation, basically you have a script in your head, a worldview, a way you see the world. This trauma destroys your worldview. The question then becomes, can I reestablish it? Can I rethink it? In other words, can I make sense of this event in the larger story of my life? Is this the last chapter, or is this just the climactic chapter from which something amazing is about to happen? I have to figure out where this event fits in the overarching meaning of my life. Here's what she basically did. She said, you know what? Maybe I've thought about this wrong. Maybe my worldview as a Christian did not allow for this murder to even be possible. God should have stopped it. Mm-hmm. Why would a good God who loves my sister allow this to happen to someone who did nothing to precipitate it? How can I even reason that? So we had to spend some time now until she found out that I was a Christian, and we started to walk through why God would allow any suffering. What does God do with suffering? What is the place of suffering in a larger story? What chapter does it fill? And after she was able to kind of re-navigate that, she found herself thriving on the backside of it. And her family started thriving and started finding, celebrating holidays again. And then she was married within a year. And I thought, wow, isn't that amazing that life just took off because you had a script for what you thought God does in the world. But the script was wrong from the beginning.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Job's friends. I remember just studying Job at the time. Because, if you look at Job's friends, he suffers twice. He suffers from all the loss, and he suffers from bad friends who have bad theology.
Right.
Right? Because their story isn't correct about how God works in the world with suffering.
Yeah.
And so she just needed to have a story that was actually, a correct story of how the world really works.
But, again, for context, she had gone 20 years wallowing in this situation, which is, reasonable emotionally when you don't have that bigger story. So I want a little more insight, Jim, with Kelly particularly, about how she climbed out of that hole, because it's so instructive to many who are living in that hole right now.
So here's what I basically said. Okay, look. So I can think of maybe 5, 6, 7 reasons why a good God would allow something bad to happen to us. And that's all we have to, and if there's a reason why God might allow it, that would cause you to rethink what just happened. So here's the first one I said to her. I said, look, if there's a God, and if Christianity is true, you have to stop living like you're an atheist. As an atheist, I believed all satisfaction, all justice, all pleasure had to be satisfied in the line segment, that was my geometry, from birth to death. As a non-believer, this is what I thought I had 90 years clean, hopefully. You'd drop dead in your sleep after a big dinner, right? That was the goal.
Yeah.
So you don't 90 clean years. Well, I'll tell you what, if something happens to you in your 50s, and then you die early, you're going to be upset. That's evil because you expected 90 clean because you have an idea of life that's a line segment. But what if you're wrong about your geometry? What if life doesn't start at birth and extend to death and it ends right there, but it actually goes through that point into eternity? That's called a ray. That's not a line segment. If life's a ray, now everything changes because there are people you know who had terrible surgeries in their infancy. Yet by the time they were 3, they don't even remember the surgery. All evil has to be measured in the context of your lifespan. So here's what I mean. If the ray is correct, 1,000 years into the other side of the second dot, into the ray, that 90 years is really small by comparison to the 1,000. 1,000,000 years into the other side of the second dot, now that 90 years is a millisecond. You could have 90 terrible years. But if the Christian worldview about life is true, God's not interested in your line segment. He's got you for your life. And the minute that ray starts for you is when you accept Christ as Savior.
So in that context, you would say that even as evil is expressed in this life, God will bend that for somebody's good, somebody in that sphere, or many.
So let me say something controversial.
Okay.
Is God ever the author of suffering?
I'm going to let you jump out and suggest what that might be.
Yes. Is he the author of evil? No. When Satan authors suffering, he authors it to destroy you. When God authors suffering, he offers it to shape you, to build you, to give you something even better. And so he will allow us to suffer
for a bigger purpose.
What father doesn't discipline his children? Author of Hebrews says.
But I've got to, in that context, going back, one of the biggest question people will ask is, how can a God that's loving and kind allow a child to suffer and die?
Because that child is not living in the line segment. That child is just like you and I. He's part of the ray.
So there's
he's
much
alive
more
right
eternal
now.
Life after this.
Yes, he's alive right now. See, we think of death because we think of it as a line segment. That second dot is final for us. But as Christians, we ought to know better than that. One more thing. A good God who's all-loving, I suspect, would want to create a world in which love is possible. How could you call him a good God if he creates a world in which you can never love anybody? But here's the dangerous problem with that. If you want love to emerge in this world, you have to create the thing that love stands on, which is dangerous. It's free agency.
Right.
There is no love without free. I can't put a gun to your head and say, do you love me, John? You'll say, Jim, you'll say yes. John, you'll say yes. But you don't mean it because you're being coerced. It turns out I have to give you the dangerous thing first, the free agency thing. That means you have to have the freedom to hate me in order to truly love me. Oh, so you want that dangerous thing called free agency? Well, yeah, it is logically impossible for God to create a world in which love exists without free agency.
Yeah.
So if you want one, you're going to have, there's no way to create a world in which love exists without free agency. But that means you have to have the true freedom to do something that happens to these victims.
Yeah.
But if life is a ray and not a segment, I got you. I got you. By the way, all of you unsolved people in crimes, or all your crimes have been unsolved, relax. Because it turns out I don't have to work within the 90 years to get that crime solved either. I don't have to work within the 90 years to satisfy all justice, to satisfy every desire you have. That guy who's stealing to get those things met, it turns out you might become a Christian and never experience all the delight you thought you were going to experience in the line segment. But it's okay. It's a ray. I got you covered. It's on the other side of the second dot. So for her, she just needed to kind of get a sense of, like, what would be the good reasons? Look, suffering is necessary to character building. All the things that atheists love the most, courage, compassion, charity, you think those things are a switch you flip? No. They're all responses. They're responses to hardship. You can't have courage without danger. I can't just say, oh, you're courageous now. No, you didn't. It's how you respond to danger that makes you courageous. So if you wanted to develop courage and compassion and charity and forgiveness, you'd have to design a world in which there is danger and suffering and transgression and poverty. These are the things that provoke the responses that actually, even as an atheist, I would have said, yeah, I want a world that has those. But see, what we mistakenly think is I can get that world by just flipping a switch. No, those are things that are absolutely responses to hardship.
Yeah. For that person who is suffering and can't get through this, going back to Kelly's story, that, you know, she hasn't had that encounter yet to think differently, that person is still there. And I'm kind of curious what you think the percentage of people in this life are sitting in that spot. 80% that have had hardship, and they're
That's
not
100%.
not
The question
able
is
to
how we
move
respond.
through.
Yeah.
So what do you say to that person, Kelly, who hasn't had that encounter with you to get this kind of input, who hasn't received it at church perhaps, or many of the Christians around her, even being a Christian, have not been able to explain this adequately? What do you say to that person?
Well, first of all, I think we're living in a world right now where almost no one has an excuse to not have information. We're in the information age.
Right.
We've written about it extensively on our website. There's a ton of material right here on the Focus on the Family interviews, podcasts of people who are trying to answer the question, how could a good God allow evil? And that's an important question that we have to answer. By the way, all of us have to explain evil. You think the explanation on the atheist side is any better than ours?
Right.
Do you think it's any more comforting than ours?
Right.
Do you think there's any hope in the atheist explanation for the problem of evil? There isn't. We all have to offer a solution. The question is which solution actually comports with the evidence and is the most satisfying. It's the best inference from evidence.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about really, if you are struggling right now, look, there's two ways we struggle with evil. One is intellectual, but the other is emotional. So if you've struggled with evil, my case for why God would allow this is meaningless to you. There's a season in which her family just needed to be held, just needed to be sat with, just needed to be, we call this a ministry of presence. Just be present. You don't need to offer answers. But for your kids who haven't yet experienced evil, it turns out that's the time to inoculate them with right thinking. So there's the intellectual case I can make, but for people who have just suffered evil, I'm not sure how satisfying that is ever going to be. There's going to be a season in which you just need to be held.
Yeah.
But for those who have, if evil is in your rear view mirror, that's a different approach. But if evil is still through your windshield, and that is probably the case for most young people, we need to start talking about these things with them right now, because it can inoculate you from suffering at an even deeper level.
Not only that, but it's appealing. I mean, if you think about it in the way that you've described it and given an answer, yeah, being that ray, the extended being that we're created to be, living for eternity with him, that
Right.
this is a blip. And these evils that we experience in this life are to help train us, and the suffering to help train us to be better and more like him.
We talk about it all the time. Does God care more about my comfort than my character? No. Not if you're talking about comfort in this life, in this side of the second dot. If you're in the set line segment, that's the time in which, you remember when Tim Keller was dying of pancreatic cancer, they asked him, how's life changed for you, Tim, now that you got pancreatic cancer? He said, well, two things. I need to kind of readjust my time. I don't have the time I thought I had. But two, he says, I realized I'm not ready to do what God has for me next. And I need to use this time to get ready for so when I stand before God, I'm ready to do what God has for me.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, there's a guy who gets the ray.
Yeah, totally. Well, Jim, this is a great start, and we've scratched the surface of the truth in true crime. So we want to make sure that we offer you this book like we normally do. If you can make a gift of any amount, we'll send it to you as our way of saying thank you for being part of the ministry. And you can do that monthly. That's really helpful to us. We call it Friends of Focus on the Family. That's how Gene and I support the ministry. I think you do too.
Yeah.
And I'd encourage you to do that right now.
And you can find out more about our guest and this great book at the website. The link is in the program description.
You were an atheist. You got into detective work in Southern California. You were part of the gang investigative unit. That had to be really interesting. I mean, just from a work standpoint, that's probably where all the action's at, right?
Yeah, it seemed like it was, and it just teaches you a lot just about young people, because most of the gangsters you're meeting were significantly younger than me.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
In that case, Javier was somebody that you made contact with as a gang member. Describe that interaction. How old was he, and what did that lead to?
So for me, I realized from the get-go, if I'm going to work with these young men, it's going to have to be a very paternal relationship, right? They're going to have to see me in a different way. I'm going to have to be the old guy and just embrace it. And so I just tried to do that. And that opened up relationships with one of these guys named Javier, who I could sense that he was a thinker. Mm-hmm. And it was helpful. He originally was involved in a pretty active gang, not in our city. His parents, or his mom, sent him to live with his maternal grandmother in our city because she felt it was a little bit safer.
Kind of get him out of the
Trying
neighborhood.
to get him out of the neighborhood. And to be honest, what happened was he pretty much drew that clique into our city because they would come and visit him there. And so then we started getting reports and complaints from neighbors and things like this. So long story short, we started to develop a relationship, which was just conversational. But I could sense that in the end, look, we're all the same human being in different settings. Mm-hmm. And what he wants out of life is also what we all want out of life, although he may think there's a different way to get it. And I remember my partner at the time, he watched a movie that had just come out, and it was called Boys in the Hood. And he said, Jim, you should watch this movie. And I'm like, this is what we do for a living.
I'm not going home and watching
It's great. I'm sure it's great, but I just don't think I'm going to probably on my day off sit with my wife and watch this movie. He says, no, you need to watch it because there's some truth in it that you need to grab. So I watched this movie, and it struck me. It was really a great story. It's a great movie. It's an R-rated movie, so I'm not going to say it's a movie everyone should watch. But for a gang officer, who at the time,
it's pretty accurate.
It was. I felt like, because here's what I noticed: we had such diversity in our city in terms of the kinds of kids who were involved in gang activity. We had multi-generational Hispanic gangs. We had African American gangs, Korean, white. We had all kinds of different gang members living in our city. And what was interesting about it was they didn't seem to share anything in common. Certainly it wasn't race. It wasn't even their backgrounds in terms of like what their family structures were so much. Like it wasn't about their economic status for sure. Some were driving really nice cars, living in nice parts of the city. Some were not. Like I'm trying to, like as an investigator, I'm just trying to, what's the common denominator here? Well, after watching this movie, light bulb goes on. The common denominator for all of these diverse groups is really simple. It's lack of dad. It's it. Now, lack of dad looks different depending on the group. Some of these kids didn't know their dad because mom never introduced them to dad. Some of these kids didn't know dad because he's been locked up almost all their entire life. I mean, some of these kids were living with their dads, but they were drunk or unavailable or disinterested.
Or abusive.
Yeah. Some of them were workaholics who were making great money, great income, living in great neighborhoods, but were never home, had no idea what their kids were doing. So lack of dad looks different depending on the setting, but it almost always produces the same kind of problem. At least it was in these gang groups I was working.
Whatever happened to Javier?
Well, what happened was, it turns out that you can overcome lack of dad. We can help this situation with lack of dad if we could just provide a certain kind of paternal mentoring. So I would talk about his life, his future, the nature of family. What is he? Because he didn't have a dad that was paying attention to him, and I just tried to come in and provide that. Because to be honest, I thought it was the only way I had in with this kid, because I don't know what this kid knows about how he's living. I'm not going to be able to pretend I do, but I could be dad in this setting. I'm J. Warner Wallace because I had a grandfather named Warner, who changed my life. That guy. So I know you can model. Even if you're not dad, you can model. So.
Yeah, no, I had that same experience with a football coach. And it's amazing the appetite that we have as young men trying to find that.
Oh, absolutely.
It's almost like somebody who's thirsty being drawn to water.
But look, we have been sold the bill of goods that any structure, family structure, any form of family will suffice, as long as you love. Well, that's true in some sense. You certainly don't want to be an abusive. No one's been to more domestic violence calls than I have, okay? But, I mean, in this room at least. But we have to be honest about the roles that we play. We're different. Parents are different biochemically. And our biochemical differences produce certain kinds of responses. And if you're raising boys, they need to see an example of what it is. What will I look like 15 years from now? What does it look like 10 years from now?
Yeah.
And I think we have to provide that modeling. So we can't, not to overestimate, of course, but most of the kids I knew, they had an active mom in their life.
Yeah.
What they didn't have was an active dad.
Yeah, it's such a wild card. I wrote about that in a book called The Good Father, and I talked about that at length. And, back to your comment about the data, all social science is proving that an engaged father is so critical to the well-being of a child, especially boys, but girls too, for different reasons. And there's no dispute now. You have secular social scientists who are coming to that same conclusion. Melissa Kearney from MIT, who's not a believer, who's written about the privileged two-parent family and the benefits that it...
So let's just say the controversial thing that Focus on the Family has stood for and been saying for years.
Here's
where it is. The data shows this over and over and over again. If you want your kids to flourish, kids who are raised by their two biological parents in a low-conflict setting...
A
thrive.
loving setting, yeah.
It's as simple as that. And that's how they typically will say it. Now, I wasn't raised that way. My parents divorced when I was 3.
Yep.
So I did not have my dad at home growing up. So I wasn't raised that way. Can you overcome it? Of course. But you're probably going to need a surrogate. And that's what I had.
Yeah.
I had a guy who I didn't even get to see that often, but his influence was so powerful. So you might think, well, yeah, I can't be the grandfather who is like going to step in and be an everyday mentor to my grandkids. That was not Warner's role in my life. I probably saw him 3 or 4 times a year.
Right.
It was the power he had when I was in his presence that made me want to be him even when I wasn't with him. So you don't have to do this every day to have that kind of impact.
The ribbon on this was Javier's voicemail, I think he left you. I don't know how many years later, but what was the voicemail? What did he say?
Years later, he came to the chief's office to kind of say, hey, he just wants you to know I'm doing good. I'm married. I've got kids. And I thought, and I could see that was in his future. He was the kind of person who was contemplative enough. He thought about things. And we have to raise our kids to be thoughtful.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence that in Romans 12:2 it says it's the renewing of your mind that's the beginning of all transformation. It's not the renewing of your emotions. It's not the renewing of your will. We have to rethink. And so we have to help. The first thing I'm going to do typically if I'm going to mentor anybody is to help them start rethinking their view of the world. That line, segment, and array thing we talked about in the first day we were together, that kind of stuff we have to start to rethink that. And we have to, I think if you raise thoughtful kids, they eventually will want to know, well, why does that work? And you're right. All of the data now, unless they're twisting the data intentionally, demonstrates that structure, that family structure, leads to the highest level of human flourishing.
And what did he say on the call?
Well, he said he just wanted me to know that, I'm married now and I've got kids. And it turns out that the things we talked about on that porch for years earlier actually ended up coming true.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, now, does every one of the kids I worked with in those days turn out so well? No, they aren't. But mentoring means you're going to find those places where you can make a difference. And you're going to
knowing the outcome.
That's right. And you're going to lean in.
Yep.
And that's going to work for some and not for others. But if you don't identify who it is in your life that you can mentor right now, then if you aim at nothing, you hit it every time. So we have to aim at mentoring somebody. So ask yourself, right now, who would you say is your mentor? Because it turns out good mentors are mentored. And if you don't have a mentor who's mentoring you, you're probably not mentoring anybody else very well. So ask that question first. Then ask yourself, okay, now that I've been mentored and I've got somebody I can lean on, who am I doing that for? And if we just did that, one up and one down, we'd change the world.
Yeah. Jim, in the book, you have a story of a guy you called Randall King. It's kind of a shocking cold case. Describe what happened and who was this guy and what was the outcome?
Well, what's interesting about Randall King's story is that he's like a lot of these guys we've worked where we finally get to trial and we're talking to the defense attorneys, and the defense attorneys are so sure this is a cold case murder, and there's no way my guy did this. I mean, I've had defense attorneys tell me this. They say, oh, I've worked a lot of guilty folks. You have to do that in this job. I get that. I want to do a good job even for those just need a good defense. But this guy, you're wrong, Jim, about this guy. This guy's not guilty. Well, the same kind of thing happened here with Randall, that he had this unbelievable pedigree in the Marine Corps, that people who knew him said there's no way a guy like this could have done that 30 years earlier, 25 years earlier. No way he could have done it, because they had knew the man. They thought they knew that man for all those years. And this is always the case. I don't work serial killers. Okay, serial killers are weird, okay? You knock on the neighbor's door after you arrest a serial killer, and they're probably going to say something like, hey, I'm glad you took that guy to jail, because that dude's weird.
Everybody avoided
He's up
him.
all night,
Right.
he's a weirdo. But cold case murders are different. You knock on the neighbor's door after you arrest somebody for a cold case, and they'll say, no way. That dude watches my kids when I'm gone. He's the best neighbor I've ever, he's the deacon at our church. That's what you hear. Because it turns out that the people who do cold case murders are not doing serial crimes. They did one murder 30 years earlier.
Right.
And they spent the last 30 years covering it, living entirely differently often, reaching heights. I've arrested fire captains. These kinds of things are just in our nature. And it made me realize that how can we hide this so well? How in the world is it that we're capable of such altruistic goodness? The same person.
Right.
Yet also could be capable of a murder 30 years earlier or 30 minutes from now. Because we have a sense that, he's reformed. Not necessarily.
So what was Randall King's deal?
Well, his deal was that he had done such great success in the Marine Corps and such a servant and such a hero that when we finally took him to jail and we're just doing closing interviews, we're just talking to the people who know him. Because sometimes they'll give you little pieces that you think, that's actually a tell. But no, this wasn't the case. The guy we talked to was his commanding officer, and he's like, no way, there's no way this guy could ever do such a thing.
And what had he done?
He had done a murder. He had murdered a guy for almost nothing, really, if you honestly just kind of provoked his pride at a job 30 years earlier. Went right into the Marine Corps afterwards. And so he was kind of off the grid for that period of time and had, like everyone else I worked, Jim, all these cold cases, they all say the same. I had one cold case, for example, where the victim was this guy's wife. His family didn't believe he did it, of course, but her family 30 years later did not believe he did it either.
Wow.
Because he'd been such an exemplary model of citizen for the last 30 years. So it made me think, this is something that's very biblical in the sense that we have to what is the nature of humanity? Like, what does biblical anthropology say about who we are? Basically, there's two ways of looking at the world. One is that humans are innately good. They are born innocent. They are corrupted by their families, their environments, the governmental systems that surround them. And so we have to change the systems and families and environments because people would stay good if we wouldn't corrupt them over time. The other view is, no, humans are actually deeply fallen. And because of that, we will corrupt families and governments and systems and communities because of our fallen nature. Which of these two things is true? And so, by the way, our kids need to know that because if you're innately good, your sense of self is different than if I have to guard against my innate fallenness. Am I capable of doing good? Yes, this is called the enigma of man. And Scripture describes it. Created in God's image, capable of doing amazing godly things, yet deeply rebellious and fallen from the fall, so often don't do those things. This enigma of man is described in Scripture, but I think it's confusing for a culture that looks at us because they've taken, for the most part, humanism elevates humans.
Right.
And it thinks very highly of humans, and it usually sees humans as innately good and corrupted by systems. And we see this language all the time right now.
So this guy, Randall King, he kills this guy years ago, and because of bullying that he expressed or something like that.
Yep.
What did you find in Randall's house that kind of tipped the scale for you and went, this is interesting?
I'll never forget the search warrant because we walk into this guy's house, 30 years upstanding, nothing to tip his hat that he had been involved. This is always the thing that is, to me, the most, I want to spend time. When you do a search warrant, you can usually spend a little more time because people are searching and you're the investigating officer. I'm just kind of like recording it in my mind, Well, in his kitchen, he had a virtual laboratory of alcohol. He had all of these canisters that were set upside down, all the bottles with canister tops. And so it looked like you could walk in and make any kind of mixed drink you could think of from any version of alcohol you could possibly. And he had this, so he had like a laboratory in his kitchen. And I was struck by, because I'd never seen these carousels that hold bottles upside down with spigots, And I'm
like a bar.
Yeah, like a bar. But in his living room, he had bookshelves that were so crowded. Some of them were like temporary, almost like if you were putting like a temporary bookshelf in a library that's made out of wire, or metal. And he had Bible studies. So he had like his Jekyll and Hyde kind of two sides of his character. Well, of course, I'm looking at, okay, so when did he become religious, I'm thinking. Because I'm always looking at it from the perspective of, is there evidence in this room? And sure enough, you could see there was one passage that occurred right after the murder where he's journaling in his Bible studies, and he's giving us little tells about his behavior, about, kind of researching the life of David and kind of seeing himself in David's world. Well, we know what King David did. He killed somebody, ultimately, after he took his wife. So, I mean, this was really interesting to me. Now, look, I'm building cumulative circumstantial cases. So it's death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for paper cuts, and this is a paper cut.
Yeah.
So does it mean he actually did this? No, doesn't mean anything. But it's part of a larger cumulative.
Did you ever
case.
confront him with that?
Oh, yeah.
And what was his face telling you?
Oh no, he stayed all the way through the conviction. He stayed adamant. This
So
is
he
what's
was
so
convicted.
interesting. Yes, and this is what's so interesting about that, is that he is the man who did this case. He is the man who did this murder. Yet he's capable of living in one extreme or the other. And then when push comes to shove, of just denying it altogether. So, and I remember his attorney was just thought we were wrong, as do most of these, because they're looking and they cannot reckon. Why do they think that we're wrong about this guy? Because they can't imagine a scenario in which a man who's been this good for that long could ever have done that. They have a false anthropology. They are holding to a humanist view of the world. You can be very easily fooled if you don't hold the correct view of humans. And one thing you can't be is when you're doing investigations is easily fooled. You want to be in a position where you think, well, yeah, okay, that's great. I understand what he's saying, but this is still well within the range of possibility because this is who we are as humans.
You also had a story about Wesley Myers. It kind of connected to the shameless idea, which is really good because, again, what we're doing here, you've identified characteristics of the criminal mind.
Yes.
And these are spiritual things.
Yes.
Shameless.
Yes.
Guilt.
Yes.
All these things. How did Wesley Myers fit into your analysis?
This was a guy who did a horrific murder, and I don't even go to all the details in the book, but I remember when we got to the point of convicting him, we were getting ready to go to trial, and it was going to be a death penalty case, and so he didn't want death penalty, so he was willing to take a plea for life in jail without the possibility of parole. We call that an LWOP, life without the possibility of parole. Now, what that meant was we would always say, okay, well, what's in it for us? Yes, we're going to not have to go to trial, but we want you to record an interview with us on video in which you tell us how you did the murder. Often we'll do that because we are looking at the crime scene and we've made certain assumptions. We want to see if we're correct.
Kind of a learning
Yeah, it's a learning experience for us. And so we do this interview with him. And I'm telling you, it was the most, my partner and I, we walked out of there. My partner says, wow, that was like chilling. This was like, I've never sat in front of anybody who's so unashamed of what he did to this woman. So it started me thinking about the difference between, because he had a wife, this killer had a girlfriend at the time, kind of a live-in. And sure enough, her name was Rachel, and she was feeling deep shame. And so I started to think, because she was a girlfriend of this, she was married to this guy. And I thought, okay, why is she feeling shame over what he did? It started me thinking about the relationship between shame and guilt. And I think in culture, we've kind of confused those two terms. We either use them interchangeably or we mistake one for the other. There's a difference between shame and guilt, okay? Guilt is when you feel bad about something you've done. Shame is when you feel bad about you. Guilt says, I messed up. Shame says, I'm a mess up. Now, it turns out that the studies on this in the secular side show that one of these is an adaptive emotion. Guilt's adaptive. Shame is maladaptive. Guilt actually leads to good stuff because when we know we've done wrong, we often want to make it right. And we know we can, and it leads us to do things that are altruistic and to do the right
it's kind
thing.
of conscience.
And to change our character.
Right.
But shame is like a corrosive acid. It just, if you feel like I can never do anything right, then you'll stop trying. And so we have to distinguish between these two. And she had no way to distinguish between these two. And it turns out that there's a Christian view of this. And when she started attending church, after this whole thing went down, she started to learn that difference. And learn that her value. So here's what I would say to young people. If you're struggling with guilt for things you've done, welcome to the family.
Yeah.
Because before I get out of the state today and get back to California, I'll have done 5 or 6 things I will not feel good about. Because this is the nature of being a human. It's back to that enigma of man thing. But if you're feeling shame, this Christian worldview offers a solution to both. So what Christianity says about guilt is that Jesus actually came and died on a cross to pay the price for your bad behavior, for all the sins you've committed. So the Christian response to guilt is forgiveness through the cross. The Christian response to shame is a new identity in Christ, where there is no condemnation in Christ Jesus. So it turns out that our worldview offers a solution to these two things. This is what we were talking about before. We have to teach our kids that we are raising you within this perspective of our view of the world, which happens to be true. If you compare what our worldview does, the resources offered by Christianity compared to the resources of secularism, you'll want to be over here. Because this isn't just true, it's good for us. Because it offers a way out of your guilt and shame that the other, you'll be in years of therapy and hoping to achieve the same.
Jim, right at the end here, and that is a great point. I mean, I often think of that. Why would people reject this? What is in them that they're saying no? Because it's so beneficial.
Okay, so you know what it is, Jim? It's humility. So this is the one chapter, I did a chapter there, the one thing that would change your metric, that increases every aspect of human flourishing at the highest level, from the depth of your relationships to the much money you're going to make to the longevity, mental health, physical health, is this thing we've been studying for 35 years in secular studies called humility. It turns out it's an ancient principle. It's only offered by one worldview. Why? Because any worldview that says you must do something to earn a result does not develop humility. That develops pride.
Right.
I had a friend, Mike Adams, who say all the time, he said, I wrote a book, Jim. It's called How to Become Humble in 10 Easy Steps and How I Made It in 8. Okay, well, there's the problem. Yeah. If you think you can do it by pursuing it, you're going to do just the opposite of it. But there is a worldview that says nothing you do is going to earn your salvation. No 10 commandments, no 5 pillars, no 4 noble truths, no karma yoga. None of that's it's done for you. It's not a doing worldview. It's a done worldview. It actually can develop humility. We have to show our kids that the reason why the other side doesn't want to bend its knee is because I want to be God. The first step of humility is there is a God and I'm not him.
Right.
And until you get to that point of humility, of surrender, you will never embrace this. As long as you want to be in control, you'll never admit that somebody else is.
Well, and the added comment is that I'll need to bend to God.
That's right.
God doesn't bend to me. And the culture is, full of examples of we're trying to have God bend to what we want.
That's right.
And that scripture that comes to my mind is every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.
That's right.
And that's why we don't need to fear. We just need to be thoughtful and winsome and engaging with people.
Hope will change your life. It's the thing on the other side of the second dot in the ray that changes the way you live between the two dots.
Hope will change your life. That's a good place to end. Jim, this has been so good. Thanks for being with us. Your book, The Truth in True Crime, another great read from your experiences as an investigative detective and cold case detective. Great application to faith. If you can make a gift of any amount, we'll send it to you as our way of saying thank you for being part of the ministry. If you could do that monthly, that's really great. And know that Focus on the Family is here to be a lifeline to you. One of the things I say to the board and to the donors I encounter is this place is bursting with content. I mean, it is a content treasure trove. And don't hold back. If you're struggling with your marriage, you're struggling in your parenting, we're here for you. Those are the core things that we do each and every day. And we have caring Christian counselors who can talk with you, supply resources to you, give you a recommendation for a Christian counselor in your area. There's just so much here. There's no excuse not to get help when you call Focus.
Yeah, we're a phone call away, 800, the letter A and the word family, 800-232-6459. I'll also invite you to donate generously when you're online and request the book by J. Warner Wallace, The Truth in True Crime. We've got all the details in the program description. And on behalf of the entire team, thanks for joining us today for Focus on the Family with Jim Daly. I'm John Fuller, inviting you back next time as we once again help you and your family thrive in Christ.